It was a huge sensational trial. Newspapers from as far away as New York and London wrote about it. It filled the pages of the Chicago newspapers every day. Some Chicago police officers themselves had said that they had seen this apparition inside the building. This trial and this murder case prompted a lot of sort of public revulsion about sausages. I got interested in this case because of the big media sensation it was. In fact, the first thing I saw was this story about how there were some reporters who eavesdropped on the jury. They tied one reporter to a chair with a rope and they lowered him down a heating vent in the courthouse. We're standing in front of the Regal condominiums on Diversey, which used to be the Luetgert sausage factory back in the 1890s. This used to be a very industrial part of Lakeview where there were iron factories and terracotta plants. And this building was where Adolf Luetgert made sausage. He was a German immigrant. He came over as a young man. He worked in leather and tanning and showed up in Chicago around the time of the Great Chicago Fire in that era. If the police and prosecutor stories are correct, it sounds basically like he was a fairly violent, hot-headed guy. Worked his way up, as a saloon keeper. He supposedly came up with his secret sausage-making recipes. I don't know, it's probably him bragging about how great his sausage was, but he claimed to have invented summer sausage, but not so sure about that. He supposedly sold some of his sausage at the 1893 World's Fair. And he was obviously pretty successful with it to have had a building this large, plus this rest of the complex that is no longer here. This is obviously not just a small little mom and pop butcher shop. Adolf and his wife Louisa lived in a house just south of the factory, or right around where we are standing right now. And in 1897, on May 1st, 1897, she disappeared. And that prompted a huge sensational mystery that the newspapers were obsessed with. What happened to Mrs. Luetgert? He claimed that she had run off because they were having economic difficulties and had basically abandoned the family. And this prompted people all over the state and other states to call the Chicago police and newspapers with reports of women they'd seen wandering around who they thought was Mrs. Luetgert. And it wasn't too much longer after that that Adolf was charged with murdering her. In the basement, they had these large vats, which they used for curing sausage. And they weren't being used at the time. His factory had been shut down temporarily because of bad economic times. But he went into the basement, according to the police, and put her body in this vat that was filled with potash and a solution that he had had his workers make up the solution ahead of time. Which kind of raises the question of, was he planning to murder her, and did he have all this set up as a way to get rid of the body? The motive for why Adolf Luetgert would have killed his wife was one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Adolf Luetgert was put on trial in downtown Chicago. It was a huge sensational trial. Newspapers from as far away as New York and London wrote about it. It filled the pages of the Chicago newspapers every day. And at the end of his first trial, the jury could not decide if he was guilty or not. It was a hung jury. A second trial was held, and this time he testified in his own defense, which may have been a mistake because the stories he told about how he was just trying to make some soap that night in the basement really didn't fly with the jury, and he was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Joliet. Some people thought he should have been hanged for it, but a life sentence was the verdict. And it was only a couple of years later that he died of natural causes inside the prison in Joliet. There were reports of hauntings here around the turn of the 20th century. In particular, in 1901, there were a few Chicago police officers who got a report that someone had seen a light moving around inside the factory building. So they went in, and this light, they saw this, just basically a spot of light moving around. They followed it down into the basement, right around the area where Louisa Luetgert's body was allegedly dissolved. And one of the police officers said that he saw faintly the white image of a ghost-like woman, and tried to grab her, and then it disappeared. And people had gathered outside the building and were watching what the police were up to. And some of them said that after the police failed to catch this bit of light that was moving around, they saw the light up at the top of the building. So that's the most solid story. I have to confess, I'm a skeptic about all ghost stories. I've never seen one myself. I'm not sure when people see ghosts if they're actually seeing a ghost or maybe imagining something. But with a story like this, you want to have a first-hand report about it. One reason why this case has some importance beyond just being interesting is that it was one of the original murder cases where prosecution was brought despite the lack of a body. Now, the police did find some bone fragments when they searched the basement of this building, and they went to where the vat was that he had allegedly dissolved his body, the body of his wife. And if he did all this, he did not do a very good job of cleaning up after it, because there were some small bone fragments. And a scientist from the Field Museum came to testify, and he looked at the bone fragments and said, "These are human bones. I can point out where they would fit on a human skeleton." But people were skeptical of scientists testifying on the witness stand, so a lot of people thought, how do we know these aren't just parts of a pig that would have been in a sausage factory? As I explained in my book, Alchemy of Bones, this trial and this murder case prompted a lot of sort of public revulsion about sausages. So the urban myth that sprung up is that Adolf Luetgert turned his wife into sausage. He was never actually accused of doing that, but you can see how people would make that sort of jump in logic that, you know, he was a sausage maker, he had a sausage factory, his wife disappeared, he dissolved her body in there. No sausage was being made at the time. But there are reports about how at butcher shops around Chicago that the butchers were saying people just don't want to buy sausage anymore. I think sales recovered not too long after that, but there was probably a dip in sales there for a while around 1897 and 1898. After I wrote my book, I heard from the descendants of one of the jurors, and they told me the story that this juror took some of those bones home with him at the end of the first trial.
So there was missing evidence.
So there's missing evidence. And there are stories about the second trial where they had less of the physical evidence to present. So if that story is true, it would explain, like, where did those bones go between the first and the second trials. But this family says that they don't know what happened to it. Because if you could find those bone fragments, now you could potentially do DNA testing on them. You could certainly know if they were human or pig. And if they were human bones, you might be able to, I mean, you'd have to find one of the Luetgert relatives, and I've talked with a couple of them, or exhume a body of one of the older Luetgert family members and compare the DNA. So theoretically, if those turned up, it would be possible to definitively solve this mystery.